Ready to get a little uncomfortable? Today, we're diving deep into behavioral addictions.
Oh, yeah. But luckily,
We're focusing on gaming disorder and food addiction today. And get this, our main sources are a university course document, official definitions from the World Health Organization.
the WHO,
Yep, and the Yale Food Addiction Scale. You might be surprised to learn that the WHO actually recognizes gaming disorder.
officially.
Yeah, officially.
Yeah.
But what does that actually mean in the real world? What does it look like?
Well, what's crazy is that even without an actual physical substance, behavioral addictions can really mess you up.
Like as bad as drugs.
Yeah. Think about it.
It's like,
Relationships, work, your finances, your whole well-being can be impacted.
seriously?
Oh, yeah. They kind of hijack your brain's reward system in a similar way to drugs do.
Wow. This course document says that behavioral addiction is basically like drug addiction, except there's no substance.
It's the behavior.
Right. It's the behavior or the feeling you get from doing something specific that takes over.
Mhm.
It's not the thing itself, it's the doing and the feeling that hooks you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the consequences can be just as bad. The document mentions this stat about gambling. 350 million people worldwide have problems with gambling every year.
350 million.
Every year. That's a lot of lives being impacted.
That puts things in perspective for sure.
Hmm.
So let's talk about gaming. Everybody loves video games, right? But when does it go from fun to gaming disorder?
That's where the WHO's classification of gaming disorder comes in. It's in something called the ICD-11.
ICD what?
ICD-11. It's like their big book of diseases.
Ah, okay.
So it's officially recognized as a health condition, Right.
Which
which is huge EE for research and for treatment.
that makes sense. So how do you actually get diagnosed with it? What are the signs?
They look for three main things: impaired control, prioritization, and continuing, even when bad things are happening because of it.
So you can't control how much you play, you choose it over everything else, and you keep playing even when it's causing problems.
Exactly. It's not just about how many hours you're gaming.
Huh?
It's about the impact it has on every other part of your life.
Right, so it really takes over everything.
And to be diagnosed, it has to go on for at least 12 months.
So we're talking about a long-term thing.
A persistent problem, not just a little phase.
So putting it in the ICD-11, it must be a big deal then.
It's huge. Think about it. Global health strategies, more research funding, overall awareness. It means countries can actually start developing public health initiatives to help people.
So it legitimizes it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This could really help people who have been struggling and trying to get it recognized for a long time.
All right. Let's move on to food addiction. We've all had those crazy cravings. But how do you know when it's more than that?
That's where this idea of chemical dependency comes in. With food addiction, your body actually starts to depend on certain foods or eating habits, kind of like with a drug addiction.
Is that even possible?
It is. And think about the usual culprits. Foods loaded with sugar, fat, salt, all that stuff that triggers those intense pleasure responses.
Oh, yeah, the good stuff.
Right? Our brains are wired to want them. And just like with drugs, you get stuck in this cycle of cravings and binging and feeling awful when you don't have it. It's hard to break free.
So this source material compares food addiction directly to things like drug and alcohol addiction. It actually says that the body has become chemically dependent on one or more substances and needs these substances to function normally.
It's the same basic idea. Even though it's not a substance in the traditional sense, your body's getting hooked on those specific foods or ways of eating.
And the source specifically calls out things that are high in sugar, flour, fat, grains, and salt.
Pretty much everything good.
No wonder it's so hard to resist.
Our brains are wired to crave that stuff. And it can be a real struggle to break free from that cycle of wanting and needing those foods.
And the source uses the word disease to describe food addiction, saying it's a chronic condition that gets worse over time. That's pretty serious.
Yeah, it really challenges the idea that it's all about willpower. It says that food addiction is a medical condition, which could have big implications for how we think about and treat it.
Hopefully it will help reduce some of the stigma around it too, so people feel more comfortable getting help.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of getting help, let's talk more about that Yale Food Addiction Scale, the YFAS.
Yeah, we touched on that briefly. How does that actually work? Is it something you can do on your own, or do you need to see a doctor?
Usually it's used as part of a bigger assessment with a healthcare professional. They'll use the results from the YFAS, along with other information, to get a better picture of your eating habits and see if you fit the criteria for food addiction.
So it's not like a self-diagnosis tool.
No, it's more like a piece of the puzzle that doctors and therapists use to help figure things out.
And it's important to remember that just because you score high on the scale doesn't mean you automatically have a food addiction.
Exactly. It's just one piece of information.
Okay.
It's all about looking at the context and the bigger picture of your relationship with food.
Right. That makes sense. So where's the line between being a foodie and having a food addiction? That seems pretty important to figure out.
Yeah. The key difference is whether your eating patterns are actually causing problems in your life, your health, your relationships, your work. You know, are you able to function normally? That's something we need to explore further. It's so interesting how both gaming disorder and food addiction kind of show how complex addiction is these days.
It's like we're programmed to want this stuff, but it's hard to know where enjoyment ends and problem begins.
Totally. And think about this with substance addiction. You can at least try to cut the substance out completely.
You can go cold turkey.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you can't exactly stop eating or never touch a video game again, can you?
True. It's
Okay.
all about finding that balance.
Right. When is it too much?
Exactly. So let's get back to food addiction.
Yeah.
The source material compares it directly to being addicted to drugs or alcohol.
Oh, yeah.
It says the body has become chemically dependent on one or more substances and needs these substances to function normally.
So even though it's not a substance in the way we usually think about it, your body is still getting hooked.
On specific foods or ways of eating.
Right. And the source specifically points to things high in sugar, flour, fat grains, and salt.
All the good stuff.
I know, right? Our brains are just wired to love that stuff. And it's the same cycle as with drugs. You crave it, you binge, and then you feel awful when you don't have it.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is, and it's hard to break.
This source actually uses the word disease to describe food addiction. It says it's a chronic and progressive condition.
Wow.
That's strong language.
It is. It really challenges the idea that it's just a matter of willpower. It's saying that food addiction is an actual medical condition, which could change the way we treat it.
Hopefully it'll also help reduce the stigma.
Yeah. So people can get help without feeling ashamed.
Definitely. Speaking of help, let's go back to the Yale Food Addiction Scale, that YFS thing.
Yeah.
How does that actually work in real life? Is it something you'd take online, or is it done with a doctor?
Usually it's part of a more thorough assessment with a healthcare professional.
So you go see someone.
They'll take the results from the YFAS and use that with other information to get a better understanding of your eating habits. And they can see if you meet the criteria for food addiction.
Gotcha. So it's not something you do on WebMD.
Not really. It's
Okay.
more of a tool for professionals.
Makes sense. And it's important to remember that a high score doesn't automatically mean you have food addiction.
No, it's just a piece of the puzzle.
Like a data point.
Exactly. It's about
Yeah.
context.
Okay. That makes sense. So how do you know if you're just a foodie or if you have a real problem?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
I think the main difference is whether those eating patterns are causing actual harm in your life.
Like real problems.
Your health, your relationships, your work. Are those things being negatively affected?
Interesting.
It's something we need to talk more about for sure.
We do. Now, you mentioned that the idea of food addiction is still kind of controversial.
Yeah. Not the scientific community is on board with it yet.
Really? So some experts don't think it's a real thing.
Well, some think the evidence isn't strong enough to call it a separate diagnosis. They say a lot of the symptoms overlap with other things like binge eating disorder. They're not sure if it needs its own category.
So it's confusing.
It can be.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that this is an area where there's still a lot of debate.
So what we know now might change in the future.
Exactly. Science is always evolving. That's what makes it so cool.
That's a good point. I like that perspective. All right, let's get back to talking about how hard it is to treat behavioral addictions.
Okay.
Like we said before, you can't just avoid food or video games altogether.
You can't just cut them out of your life.
They're everywhere.
So treatment needs to be about finding that healthy balance.
So how do you do that?
It's about learning to manage those behaviors.
So they don't control you.
Exactly. It's about finding a way to enjoy these things without letting them take over your life.
And I'm guessing there's no magic bullet.
No, it's
No.
going to be different for everyone,
Tailored to each person.
right? It could involve therapy, support groups, lifestyle changes, and sometimes even medication.
So it's a combination of things.
It's finding the right mix to help someone regain control.
And live a good life,
Exactly. And remember, recovery is a journey.
not a destination.
There will be ups and downs.
Right.
But with support and the right strategies, it's possible to manage these conditions.
Yeah, that's reassuring to hear.
And like with any health issue, the earlier you get help, the better.
Absolutely. So let's zoom out for a second and look at the bigger picture. How are these behavioral addictions impacting society as a whole?
That's a big question.
It is.
But I think the fact that we're even talking about behavioral addictions is a good thing.
How so?
It's opening up a conversation about mental health and well-being.
That makes sense.
It helps to reduce stigma and encourage people to seek help. And it's also forcing us to rethink our relationship with technology and food.
They're such big parts of our lives.
They are. And we're starting to see the downsides of too much screen time and processed food.
It's a wake-up call.
It is. It's time to make some healthier choices.
For sure. So how do we do that?
Well, it's not just on individuals to make better choices.
Mm-hmm.
We need to push for bigger societal changes.
What kind of changes?
We need to address things like the way the food and gaming industries market their products.
They can be pretty aggressive.
They can, especially when they target kids and other vulnerable people.
We need more regulations.
We do.
Mm.
And better access to mental health services. And more research into what causes these behavioral addictions and how to treat them.
So it's a shared responsibility.
It is. We need a multi-pronged approach.
It sounds like you're calling on all of us to step up.
I am.
Yeah.
We need to be more aware, more informed, and more active in shaping a healthier future for everyone.
I feel like we're all in this giant experiment, figuring out how to live with technology and food in a healthy way.
It's definitely a unique time. And with all these new challenges come new opportunities, I think.
To learn and grow.
Exactly. I'm excited to see how we adapt as a society.
Me too.
Yeah.
It's a little overwhelming, but also exciting. Okay, so we've covered a lot today. What are the main takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that behavioral addictions are a real thing. They work a lot like substance addictions, hijacking the brain's reward system, and they can have some really serious consequences.
And gaming disorder and food addiction are prime examples. The WHO even recognizes them now.
They're legit.
And we have to remember that even though there's no physical substance involved, they can still really mess up your life, your relationships, your job, your finances, your well-being. It's all connected.
It really is. And it's so important to catch these problems early and get help.
Yeah.
The sooner the better.
Because it can spiral.
It can. And there are things that can help. Therapy support groups, lifestyle changes, even medications sometimes.
It's about finding what works for you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about personal responsibility either. We need to advocate for broader changes in society to create a more supportive environment.
So it's about pushing back against things like predatory marketing and making sure people have access to mental health services.
Exactly. It's a group effort.
For sure. Now, before we wrap up, I want to leave you with something to think about. We talked a lot about the criteria for gaming disorder and food addiction. Things like losing control, prioritizing the behavior continuing even when it's causing problems. But those patterns can show up in other areas of life too, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What about our relationship with work? Or social media? Or shopping? Or even exercise? What does a healthy habit cross the line and become something more?
Food for thought?
It is. It's important to be aware of the potential for behavioral addiction in all areas of our lives.
So we can stay balanced.
Exactly. And remember, if you think you might have a problem, don't be afraid to reach out for help. There are people who care and want to support you.
We're all in this together, and knowledge is power. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of behavioral addictions. Until next time, stay curious.